Welcome back. My name's Alex. I'm a consultant psychiatrist. Today I want to take some time to talk a little bit about personality. So many people have no grasp of what a personality is, and I see this all the time. People in my personal life, clients, patients, bizarrely, even other mental health professionals. And you can see as a result of this lack of knowledge, it really impacts people's lives because not knowing about personality means you know so much less about yourself, other people, how to construct a life around your personality, how to form and maintain relationships, how to design a career. Learning about personality theory can help you with all of these things and much more. So, what is a personality? How can you define it? Essentially, a personality is a set of traits, and every trait includes behaviors, emotions, ways of feeling, ways of thinking. But importantly, a trait is also a perspective. It's a lens through which you view the world. For example, if you're industrious by nature, then you tend to view the world as a place to do work and a place full of opportunity. If you're an extrovert, you view the world as a social landscape. If you're an introvert, you're more into one on one interactions and you value depth of knowledge rather than having broad, superficial experiences. So it's really important to understand that personality isn't just what you do, but very much how you look at things. And oftentimes, people get into conflicts because they see the world in a very different way. Indeed, very different facts about the world become apparent to them, and then arguments are formed on that basis. Personality affects almost everything about you. It'll affect what you like, your predispositions, but also your vulnerabilities. It will affect what kind of career you might choose, who you might be attracted to, who you might be compatible with for a long term relationship. It will affect what you're good at and also what you're bad at. It's important to understand that every personality trait is both a strength and a weakness at the same time. For example, take emotional sensitivity. Most people think of emotional sensitivity as a bad thing, but actually it has many strengths. It allows you to pick up on what other people are feeling quite easily. It makes you much better at maintaining socially harmonious relationships. But obviously, it does come with downsides as well. It means you feel things more deeply and more intensely than other people. And people who are more emotionally sensitive are much more likely to, if they have something bad happen to them, see it as a more of a traumatic experience rather than just a difficult experience. Our personality is affected by a few different factors, but broadly you can divide them into genetics and environment, although it's actually more complicated than that in the final analysis. But certainly, genetics play a huge role. On average, for psychological traits like personality traits, genetics play at least 50% of the role, have 50% of the impact on our personalities. And of course, environment has around 50% as well. People don't normally like this fact, they see it as kind of biologically deterministic. But at the same time, it can be quite freeing to understand that nature has bestowed on you a certain set of traits and predispositions. And part of your job to grow as an individual is to come to learn a little bit what your nature is, and then to construct a life that's harmonious with your nature, as we'll talk about a little later. Although you can also start to expand your personality traits as you encounter different situations in life, and that can be a tremendous source of growth as well. The best theory of personality we have is called the Big Five theory of personality. People who study psychology will be familiar with this. And the cool thing about this theory is that rather than, as with most scientific enterprises, it's a theory that someone just came up with and tried to find data in order to prove, with the Big Five, it's the opposite. What people did was actually ask lots of people different personality questions, get a huge amount of data, and then do a form of statistical analysis called factor analysis on that data. And using that technique, they came up with the five factors. So, in contrast with a lot of science, with the Big Five, the theory is actually born of the data rather than the data being born of the theory. And that really gives this theory a lot of scientific credibility. So, how does the Big Five theory actually work? Essentially, the idea is that Everyone exists on 5 different spectrums, which represent 5 different personality traits. Those spectrums are 1. Openness, 2. Conscientiousness, 3. Neuroticism, 4. Extroversion, and 5. Agreeableness. So, going through them one by one, openness is the tendency to be interested in new ideas and also in aesthetics and beauty. So, if you're high in openness, you're really interested in novelty, newness, innovation, art, philosophy, film, poetry, that kind of thing. If you're low in openness, you tend to value more the old than the new, and you tend to not be into innovation as a solution, but more tradition. So, not surprisingly, people who are high in openness tend to lean politically left, and people who are low in openness tend to lean politically right. Conscientiousness is about how duty bound and hardworking we are, and also how orderly we are. So, people who are high in conscientiousness, they tend to be industrious, they work really hard quite naturally, and they also like things in a very particular order. They tend to be more neat. People who are low in conscientiousness, they're not as hardworking, but they tend to have an ability to enjoy the present a lot more. They're less duty bound. They also tend to be okay with things being a bit more disorderly. Neuroticism is another word for emotional sensitivity, and it's not the best word choice in terms of marketing. But it's just like how we discussed earlier. People who are high in neuroticism tend to be more emotionally sensitive, and people who are low in neuroticism tend to be more resilient. The next one is extroversion. People who are extroverts, as we all know, are very social. They tend to love forming a relatively large number of more superficial relationships, whereas introverts prefer depth and one on one interactions. They also have a much greater capacity to spend time alone. And lastly, we have the spectrum of agreeableness. People who are highly agreeable, they tend to be very empathic, compassionate, polite. They tend to value the needs of others over their own. They tend to value social harmony over rationality. People who are the opposite, who are very disagreeable, they're much more better at arguing and advocating for themselves or for their community. And they're going to favor rationality, i.e., what is true, over social harmony, i.e., what is polite. So that's an overview of those 5 traits. Now, after people start to learn about personality, the next question they tend to ask is, well, if I don't like aspects of my personality, how can I change it? Can I change my personality traits? And the first thing to say here is that it's really worth spending some time, some years even, learning what your nature is and then constructing a life that really suits your nature. Before you do anything else, it's really helpful to understand what your predispositions are, because then that puts you in a position to make the most out of your strengths. You're not going to be constantly running uphill. If, for example, you love spending time alone, you should probably find a job that involves a lot of time being spent alone, because otherwise you're going to be chronically exhausted. If, on the other hand, you're extroverted, you should find a job that puts you around people, like events planning, for instance. And if you do have a job that involves you spending a lot of time alone, you're probably going to hate it and it's going to drain you and exhaust you. Now, that being said, after you have spent some time learning what your nature is and constructing a life that complements it, there is scope to cultivating new personality traits. And actually, I'm relatively optimistic about this in the sense that I think there's tremendous scope to activate and cultivate traits that you're not necessarily gifted with naturally. But what people really have to be aware of is that when you're doing this, you are swimming upstream. It's a difficult process. It's a long process. If, for instance, you're an introvert and you want to become more extroverted, you should be aware that this is something that's going to take you months to years to figure out, and it's going to take consistent practice. Based on personality experts I've spoken to, the general advice is if you want to cultivate a new personality trait, say you want to become more extroverted, it's best to practice it in a small way but consistently and regularly. See if you can act a little bit more extroverted in a small way every day for 6 months, and that is a way that you can slowly build up the trait. It's very unrealistic to expect that you can very rapidly change from one kind of person to another in a very short amount of time. Although rarely this can happen when people have certain dramatic life experiences or what someone might refer to as a moment of clarity. So obviously there's a lot to say about personality in general. If you want more detail, you can check out the link in the description for an audio only podcast that goes into depth on the Big Five theory of personality. But before we go, here are some take home messages. Understanding personality theory will put you ahead of most people when it comes to understanding yourself, understanding people in general, and relationships. 2. You should think of every personality trait as both a strength and a weakness at the same time. And 3. You should construct a life that helps you make the most of your personality's strengths while minimizing the impact of your personality's weaknesses. And 4. Yes, it absolutely is possible to cultivate a new personality trait, but you need to be aware that it takes work and consistency, and it's better to approach it in small ways regularly than to expect that you can make some dramatic shift in your personality over time.